Welcome back to episode 3 of the Rights of the Lake series, where we are talking about rights of nature as it pertains to the Great Lakes Basin region. And for episode 3, we have Tish Odell and Ben Price back with us from CELDF. Hello to the both of you, and thank you for joining us again today.
Good morning.
Great. Hi, Tamara. Nice to see you again.
Such an important topic to talk about today. Today, we're actually getting into actual legislation that is happening or has been introduced in the Great Lakes Basin region. Before we dive into that, if you are new coming on to this series, if you go watch episode 1, you can learn more about Tish and Ben and a little bit more of their background. We're not going to do that in this episode. You can go back and do that. So today we're talking about the New York Bill of Rights and the rights of nature movement and the laws of self-governance as it pertains to rights of nature. So we are going to dive right in with the first questions here. And Ben, this first one is for you. What is the New York Rights of Nature Bill, and why is it such a big deal in simple terms?
Well, thanks, Tamara. What I'd like to do is actually read a little bit from the bill. It's called the Great Lakes and State Waters Bill of Rights, and this is in New York State. It actually has a bill number because it has been introduced into the Assembly in New York, and that is A05156 for the legal geeks who want to look it up online. And it's pretty inspiring, actually. I want to go ahead and read from the justification. It's kind of the preamble to the bill, and that'll probably give the best sense of what this is about, in the words of the folks who are proponents of the bill in New York State. So here it is. I'll read from it, and I'm quoting. We, the people of the Great Lakes and waters of New York State, hereby proclaim that no person, institution, or nation has the right or authority to participate in activities that contribute to the irreversible changes of the Earth's biogeochemical cycles or undermine the genetic and species diversity, nor the integrity and resilience of its ecological functioning, the consequences of which would fall on succeeding generations as an irrevocable form of remote tyranny. We, the people of the Great Lakes and waters of New York State, reclaim, reaffirm, and assert our fundamental and inalienable rights. And in recognition that our very survival relies on a healthy Great Lakes ecosystem, we seek to ensure that the inherent rights of the natural world, including the values, the interests, and the rights of the human community, as well as the traditional inherent relationships, treaty rights, and customs of indigenous peoples, are no longer subordinated to the accumulation of surplus wealth and unaccountable political power. And we, the people of the Great Lakes and waters of New York State, declare and enact the following Great Lakes Bill of Rights, which establishes the irrevocable rights for ecosystems to flourish, regenerate, and persist. This law elevates the local land community's rights over the powers claimed by corporations and governments. And so that's the kind of the preamble, the introduction to the bill. And to get into the meat of it, what does this actually do? At least the rights-based parts, the first half of the bill. I'll read from that, and it's not long. It enumerates some rights that are central to the bill. I won't read every word. It's not necessary, but to give a flavor to our watchers here today and let them really get a sense of what this bill would do. And so down into the first section, the Declaration of Rights. The first of those is rights of the Great Lakes ecosystem, and I'm quoting. The Great Lakes and the watersheds that drain into the Great Lakes and their connecting channels, as well as the watersheds and ecosystems throughout the state of New York, shall possess the unalienable and fundamental rights to exist, persist, flourish, naturally evolve, regenerate, and be restored by culpable parties, free from human violations of these rights and unencumbered by legal privileges vested in property, including corporate property. It goes on and it defines what the Great Lakes ecosystem encompasses. I won't go through all of that. The second right that's enumerated is right to a clean and healthy environment. The people and natural environment, including each ecosystem and watershed within the state of New York, shall possess the right to a clean and healthy environment, which shall include the right to clean and healthy Great Lakes and the Great Lakes ecosystem. The third right enumerated is the right to freedom from toxic trespass, and it reads, the people of the state of New York, as well as the Great Lakes ecosystem and the watersheds that drain into the Great Lakes and their connecting channels, as well as the watersheds and the ecosystems throughout the state of New York, shall possess a fundamental and an unalienable right to the integrity of their bodies, ecosystems, and physical aspects, and be free from toxic trespass upon or within them. Therefore, the right to be free from toxic trespass shall not be violated. And when we say toxic trespass, just an aside here, we're actually talking simply about poisoning, a right not to be poisoned. And finally, the fourth right enumerated is this, the right to freedom from monetization. And what does that mean? The Great Lakes and the watersheds and ecosystems throughout the state of New York shall possess the unalienable and fundamental right not to be owned, privatized, or monetized. These rights shall include emancipation from all claims of vested property rights to the extent that such rights purport to allow the violation of the rights of the Great Lakes ecosystem, the watersheds and ecosystems throughout the state of New York, or the people of the state of New York. Prohibited monetization of the Great Lakes ecosystem shall include, but not be limited to, carbon trading, natural asset companies, ecosystem services, and patenting of life forms. And so I'll stop there. That's really covers kind of the intent with the preamble justifications and the rights that are enumerated in the bill.
And from my perspective, again, as we talked in the last episode, common sense, the right to not be poisoned. Corporations, obviously, because of the corporate property clause, and that obviously would have a problem with not poisoning us, but common sense, again, on that. Tish, how did this bill come together, and who are the key players other than CELDF and Patrick Burke, who is the New York State Assemblyman who actually introduced this legislation? How did it come about?
Well, actually, yeah, the story, it's really different. It's different than any of the other stories I think Ben would agree that we have to tell from CELDF and the work we've done over 30 years. But, the last episode, we talked about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights and, and all the media attention that bill got. Well, Representative Patrick Burke in Buffalo, New York area, he also saw some of the media coverage. And so back in 2018 and 2019, while Toledo residents were collecting signatures to put the Lake Erie Bill of Rights on the ballot, Representative Burke actually took the language and he copied pretty much most of it, just switched out things that said Toledo, Ohio, put in what he had to for New York, and he introduced that version into the New York legislature as the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And that was all unbeknownst to us. I mean, we didn't know that was happening. We did see some article then about it after the fact. But after Libor was overturned by the federal court, he then reached out to CELDF and he asked if we could help him draft this Great Lakes Bill of Rights. Again, I made sure I let him know, you do know that the Lake Erie Bill just got overturned by the federal court. And he said, yeah, I'm definitely aware of that. And it's why I think it's really important that he reintroduces this bill again. You got to keep trying. Like, he understood that. And he also said that he had evolved in his thinking and that just protecting Lake Erie wasn't enough because all the Great Lakes obviously are interconnected. And
Right.
So that's how the first version of the Great Lakes Bill of Rights came into being. We helped him draft it and he just kind of took it and he introduced it, which is different for us because there wasn't, usually our work starts from the local or the community members reaching out. And so this was completely new for us, but we're always up for a challenge and trying something new. So we went with it. And when he introduced the revised version, then we started, obviously we're like alerting people in New York, like, hey, do you know this bill has been introduced? And people started getting engaged. We had to first educate them about rights of nature and what the bill was about. And as we did that, they would, other people saw it, and then other, contacts we had from other parts of New York. So not just Western New York and the Buffalo area. So we were talking to people in New York City, like the Hudson River, and they were like, well, or the Atlantic coast. There was a project that people wanted to stop there with the big industrial wind project going that was proposed there. And they were upset about that. And they were like, we told them about the bill. And they're like, well, yeah, but we don't live like on the Great Lakes. All those conversations, we started gathering this feedback from people all around New York. And then that became the basis for the bill that Representative Burke introduced in 2025, the one that Ben just read from. So there's now folks, in New York City area, the Finger Lakes, engaged in this and educating their communities about the bill. And we also had input, you could tell from what Ben read, from Indigenous people and their voices, and we incorporated some of that into
That's important.
Current version. Right.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important aspect to include.
Right. And so again, this goes back to, it wasn't intentional to do, it's like, but there was an opportunity with Representative Burke introducing a rights of nature bill at the state level. It was also became the first bill introduced into U.S. state legislature around rights of nature and recognizing ecosystems and water bodies.
Yay. Thank you, Patrick Burke.
Yes. So, whatever, we also know like that it didn't happen. We educated him about that. We were very upfront with the people about that this isn't going to pass and this is going to take time. And so, but just seeing it in writing and like the parts Ben read, that helps people, I think, to envision how this could look, how it could work, how it's different from what we have. And then there's also some opponents to the bill, and I just want to point this out so that people who want to start working on rights of nature that think, this is a great idea, but, this surprises people. But some of the major environmental groups, have come out against the bill or won't support the bill, and that this is common. And so they shouldn't be deterred by that. We have to remember everything has been corporatized, including activism. It's a hard truth that people who take on rights of nature have to be ready for and be able to overcome. The idea that we can just turn over the responsibility of protecting nature to environmental NGOs, that has to be overcome. It's we, the people who live in and rely on the same and are part of that same healthy ecosystem, that we have to take on the responsibility ourselves.
Yeah, and that leads into the next question that I have, and it kind of ties into what you said about some environmental groups not supporting this. And I think, and Ben, you can speak on this a little bit more, I think, and I think that ties into the not owned, privatized, or monetized, right? So how does this law compare to traditional environmental regulations to where certain environmental groups are against rights of nature legislation?
Well, we've talked about it almost endlessly, it seems, but that's only because we've been at it for so long. But the model for so-called environmental protection that we've been using since 1970 with the establishment of the EPA and the creation of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, things like that, has been to regulate how the damage to the environment is going to proceed. Not to stop it, but to regulate how much damage is done. And I've been very kind of hostile towards this whole idea for a long time. But I sort of understand how environmentalists kind of got sucked in and went along with it. It sounded like, well, if we can at least limit the damage, that's better than doing nothing, just dumping raw sewage into the rivers or just letting the coal-fired plants, just pump as much CO2 and mercury into the air as they can possibly do. Sure, that's an improvement. But it isn't environmental protection, because what happened, of course, was that corporate lobbyists descended on lawmakers and negotiated outcomes with them. Of course, often enough, the NGOs were also asked to sit in often after the negotiations had happened, but to get their kind of assent to the idea that what we're going to do is say there's a maximum amount of harm that can be allowed by law. And when for permits to be issued, the permit holder has to agree not to exceed those maximum agreed upon legally established amounts. But of course, it's been front loaded. The amount of harm to be done has been negotiated by the so-called regulated industries. With what purpose in mind? To allow just enough harm to be done for the projects that the corporations have in mind to proceed and for them to create the amount of profit they had intended to make all along. And so what happens with the environmentalists? Well, they're brought in to demand that the regulations be enforced to the hilt, that they must be enforced without any kind of exceptions. Well, great. So what we've done as environmentalists and did for years, and CELDF did up until about the late 1990s, is make sure that the permits were being issued when they were being issued, that there would be compliance with the regulations that were put in place. But it really amounted to saying, we demand that permits be issued to legalize harm, but only so much. That's hardly where a true environmentalist wants to be taking their stand, is to say that only as much as it takes to make enough money for the investors and the corporations. That's not environmentalism. And to really answer your question, I mean, what's different is that this law says that no, it's not about regulating how bad or how much the harm's going to be. It's about saying that nature has legal rights that we're going to recognize from now on. Not that we're going to grant those rights, but that we should have all along recognized those rights, just as we recognize rights for human beings. And unfortunately, just as the Supreme Court recognized rights for property in the form of corporations, which obviously is an abrogation of what rights are all about. Property can't have rights. We know that. I mean, nature is considered property and it doesn't have any rights. Rights of nature is saying nature is not property. It is a rights-bearing entity.
That affects every single one of us.
Definitely.
The point that I wanted to make is when you were talking about a maximum amount of damage, what is allowed, it's usually always exceeded as well. And that is evidenced by the condition of our lakes. It's like once you're creating that amount of damage, it's hard to stop them from creating more. I think saying maximum amount is kind of like it's absurd to me. Maximum amount of damage, because we know they don't stop.
And it's compounded because, yes, the corporations exceed what's legally allowed by the permits that the state issues to them. Usually the state issues them to legalize the maximum amount, and they exceed it. And the reason they exceed it is because the fines that are involved are nominal and they're absorbed as a cost of living. And as a matter of fact, the fines can be deducted as a tax deduction as a cost of doing business, so that there's really no loss. But the other piece of it is that when you issue a permit to one corporation and say you can't exceed the maximum legalized amount of harm, and then you issue another permit to another corporation and they're not allowed to exceed the maximum allowed amount of harm, now you have twice the maximum amount of harm being produced. Now, how many more permits are being issued? Lots. And how exponentially is the harm being increased with that system? It's not being calculated. It's not being tracked because it's irrelevant. Destroying the natural world in order to support the capitalist drive towards more profit for investors. It is a religion of modern times. It's dogma. You just can't depart from it without meeting the whole power of the government coming down on you.
That religion of modern times, another powerful statement from Ben Price. You're full of them, honestly. I want to talk about the self-governance aspect of this because I think this is an important point for people to understand as far as rights of nature goes. Why does this bill emphasize community self-governance instead of relying on state and federal enforcement? And I think we can piggyback off of what Ben just said with that one. But then also, how does recognizing the legal rights of nature expand the rights of communities themselves?
Well, one, I think building on what Ben just said, I mean, we have over 50 years of this experience and data to show us that leaving the protection, I think, of the natural environment in our place-based communities to the state and federal government and their entities doesn't work. I mean, we've witnessed and lived with the consequences of the decisions made by federal agencies like the EPA or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the state departments like the DEP or Department of Health, things like that. And I was just talking with someone the other day, and I used the example of a data center coming to a community, and the community members decided, well, no, this is going to do more harm than good in their community. And what if you could say no? And I said, well, then maybe if that could happen, so like if this bill passed, you would be able to do that. Then maybe the community next to them also says, when the data center moves there, thanks, but no thanks. And this continues, community after community. Well, at some point, right, we as a culture and society are going to have to come to grips with the fact that if no community wants the data center, the harm that I'm using in this example, then other decisions are going to have to be grappled with, right? Like, so do we really need this or want to do everything online? I mean, here we're using this, right? But all these emails that are stored and all the ways we're communicating with technology, I mean, I don't know. Do we need AI? Does future generations, do they need it? I don't know. I mean, I haven't ever heard anyone having this conversation. These things just come to us as, well, you do need it. It's going to be better for you. It's going to make your life better. But, I think this is like, we don't have to grapple with these because we can't stop the harms, right? So the harms are just kind of like Ben's talking about in capitalism and the way the system's set up. It's just a given that it's going to happen. And so you don't have to even get to that point of grappling with those really hard questions and reckoning with them. And then we see things, we're dealing with things, though, the effects, right? The increased cancer rates, we're on the brink of major ecological collapse all over the earth, and it's all because we've been stripped of any legal authority and agency to say no, even though we know they're wrong and harmful.
Yeah, the bill is I'm attached to the bill. I think that it does what needs to be done. The language in the second part that I haven't read from, and I can read a little bit from it if you like, but it essentially empowers all of the local governments, the municipalities of New York State, to enact their own regulations. And when I say regulations in this context, I mean to recognize the rights of their local ecosystems, and then to decide how much more protection is needed for it than the state has actually put forward, even included in this law, these rights and so forth, to go further and to be specific about local ecosystems that can be protected. One of the concerns, of course, that even progressive folks have is there's a real distrust of localized power, localized political power. Mm-hmm. We know where that comes from. It comes from the racist past and the Jim Crow laws and the rest of it. And that there's valid concern there, that we understand that. But we have some precautionary language in this bill. So it doesn't actually just empower all local governments to make whatever laws they want. It empowers them to make laws to protect the rights of the community and the rights of their local ecosystems. I'm just going to go ahead, if we have time for it, I'd like to read from section 4 and 5, and they're not real long, about the local, municipal, and county powers that are recognized by this bill.
Please.
And so in section 4, it reads, the municipalities and counties of the state of New York shall possess legal authority to enact and enforce laws that protect their local ecosystems by asserting for them the same rights and other provisions of Title 23. Well, this is the bill that we're talking about, the rest of the rights that are mentioned in here, including but not limited to regulations and prohibitions free from state preemption or challenge by the assertion of competing rights of corporations. And Section 5 says, and this is the limitations on these powers, Section 5 says, certain local laws adopted pursuant to subdivision 4 of this section shall not be subject to preemption by local or state laws or the state constitution, provided that 1, such local laws do not restrict fundamental rights of natural persons, their local communities, or ecosystems secured by local or state law or the state constitution, and 2, such local laws do not weaken protections for natural persons, their local communities, or ecosystems provided by local or state law or the state constitution. And then finally, the end of the bill says this: all treaty reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather are not subject to enforcement actions by municipalities, counties, or state under this section or any local law adopted thereunder. In other words, the interests of indigenous folks who happen to live within the jurisdiction of the state of New York, their treaty protections are not affected in any way by this. And there are ways that we can anticipate that it might be interpreted to damage those treaty rights, and we wanted to be sure that they were protected.
Why do you think the opposition to this is so intense?
I'm not sure it's intense. I think that it's actually uninformed. It's more uninformed. And so I think it's about caution, maybe even fear of the unknown, because no one's seen a law like this before, a law that empowers communities to enforce protections of the local community's rights and the environment's rights. People, I think, we can say justifiably, to the extent that they're uninformed about it, they can be concerned or worried that it might open cans of worms and so forth. Okay, we've heard those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And we've done the precautionary act of putting these limitations on the local lawmaking to ensure that whatever law is passed at the local level cannot in any way infringe on established rights and even regulations. You know, you've heard us talk about how regulatory law is limited in whatever positives it can offer to protection of the natural environment. But even those laws aren't going to be simply overturned by this. Those what protections are there can be exceeded, but not diminished, essentially. And that goes for rights for people as well, that the rights of people cannot be overturned or diminished by local law. And I think that's an important caveat for this empowerment of local governments.
So there was one section that you stated, not against natural persons, and that speaks against corporate personhood, right? So
yeah, natural persons are you, me, and the rest of humanity. Yes.
Right.
But corporations are legalized or juristic persons. They are not natural persons.
Right. So are you seeing with this legislation in New York pushback by corporations because of that language?
Oh, and
has that happened yet?
Maybe I can ask Tish to compare, to answer that question, comparing what corporations did behind the scenes to fund the opposition to the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. Oh, by the way, they failed, at least in stopping it from being enacted. But yeah, I don't know. Tish, if you think about it, the corporations, they didn't necessarily come out and, well, they did. They advertised against it and so forth. But those who were funding the opposition, for instance, to Libor, were not actually upfront and saying, yeah, it's us, we're doing it.
Yeah, no, they hit all that. I mean, and part of it too is I don't think right now, I don't think they're taking it as seriously. But one of the things that I see an increase in, which is really interesting, and I think it is some of the pushback, but it's not like what Ben's talking about in people's faces. It's the this Green Amendment push that's everywhere. There's a lot of states that are now, and they'll go like, oh, well, yeah, we don't really need rights of nature because we're going to work on the Green Amendment instead. And I'm not against I mean, this isn't like me saying I'm against green amendments again, but this is what happens a lot, right? It's fragmenting. We come up with a different idea. And to me, the green amendment, it focuses a lot on humans, right? It's not so much like nature's in there, the environment is there, but again, it still is that separation that I think is really pervasive. And yeah, in a lot of them. I mean, I haven't read all of them, obviously, but the ones I have taken a look at, that seems to be. And I think that's an important point, like protecting human rights. Of course, we have that in the rights of nature bills. That's always in there, right? That's the part Ben read about the toxic trespass and all that. But in our capitalist consumer culture, it's not enough, because sometimes things might be perceived as being good for humans, like a project that is coming to town and it's going to bring jobs, or maybe it'll increase development or tourism, like in the form of, let's say, vacation homes or hotels or something like that. So, it's good for humans, I guess, in that aspect. And that's what they would argue. But is it really good for the lakes, the fish, the plants around there? I mean, if they're going to clear cut the forest and there's going to be more sewage because now you've got more hotels or vacation homes or whatever. So there's long-term effects to the community and the whole ecosystem. And that could be more harmful to the natural community, more habitat loss, more spraying of chemicals, all that stuff. But no one is saying that's why rights of nature is different. We're not prohibiting any particular issue or project outright, but it's again giving that authority back to the community to actually be asking more questions and being able to find out exactly what are their values, their priorities, their obligations to the life in the community now in the current state where they are, and also how will this impact the future? I mean, that's where that indigenous comes back in, right? Thinking of the next generations. So the short-term profit versus the long-term harm again.
Mm-hmm. And the Green Amendment, speaking about that, I'm in Pennsylvania, and we've had what you might call it, they didn't call it the Green Amendment to begin with, but in 1972, a constitutional amendment added Article 1, Section 27 to the Declaration of Rights in the Pennsylvania Constitution. And it recognizes the right of Pennsylvanians to clean air, water, and soil. But then what it does, instead of empowering communities to actually state those rights in law and enforce them where they live, it says that the state will protect the resources of the state in trust for Pennsylvanians. Now, the resources of the state means the stuff that is there for humans to use. And I guess the implication is we won't use it all up in one lifetime. But of course, they're trying to do that as much as they can, because the faster and greater the profit to be made, it's a booming economy, and that looks great for all the politicians. It won't look good for those generations into the future that Tish is talking about, and indigenous people routinely consider before they make important decisions, and our society does not.
Yeah, and
Gosh, it's so true.
Another aspect that, tying into like the idea you brought up, Tamara, about the corporate personhood, right? So most of the time, these corporations that are proposing these projects and development, whatever it is, or extraction or whatever the project is, they don't live in the community. Mm-hmm. So, same thing with our state and federal. You might have one representative who lives in your community, but the bodies as a whole, the state legislatures, the federal legislature, all that, they don't live in your community. So, that's the thing. Again, we keep talking about that, that if you live in this place-based community, you're directly part of that ecosystem. The impacts directly impact you, your health, your family's health. So of course you're going to fight more to protect what's there. But I can tell you too, an aspect of our culture, I mean, working with communities, how many times I've heard well, if this comes, I'm just going to move. If this project comes to town, well, it's like I have news for everyone. Like these projects and harms eventually come to every community, which is what we're seeing. That's why we're in the place we are. And, we also have to stress that nature doesn't abide by the lines that we humans draw on the maps.
Right. So important.
So you can maybe run, but you can't hide.
Right. You mentioned also, Tish, that, and that's something that we need to talk about, I think, for a moment, a little bit earlier in this conversation. You mentioned that this New York Bill of Rights most likely is not going to pass. So I want you to give a little bit of explanation as to why that is. And then also, if it were to pass, what sort of impact would we see if the rights of nature legislation were to pass, not only in New York and its water rights and the Great Lakes water rights, but surrounding states and even Canada, because Canada borders the Great Lakes as well.
Well, I don't want to be presumptuous at all, because, that's going to be up to New Yorkers if the Great Lakes Bill of Rights passes in New York.
Right.
I live in Ohio.
Please vote yes.
Yeah. So it's going to kind of be up to them how they want to use their law. But I would say I'd love to see as many communities use it to stop current pollution that's been ongoing for years, because of maybe the polluter has a legal permit to pollute. So maybe they can use it to challenge those are things that are still going on. I'd also like to see communities use it to stop proposed harmful projects in their communities. And of course, we know the system will attempt to shut their efforts down and off and all that stuff. But if what makes New York so exciting to me is because it is at the state level, and that these rights, like the minute it would pass, it would be different from Lebor, because that was just one city, right? It wasn't at a state level. So only Toledo residents could actually use the law. Imagine this would be everywhere in the state. So if all these communities now have this, there could be tons and tons of challenges and, in the form of lawsuits and things like that. And even maybe local government bodies like saying, well, now we have this and that we can overturn this. We have the authority now to do this. And again, it's not going to come without risks and challenges, and none of us have a crystal ball. So we don't know exactly what this would look like, but I just think it would be so exciting to see how it could, like this whole idea that we can't make change, we can't experiment with it. Well, there'll be some things that are maybe positive and some negative, sure, but we, look at the laws that are passed now. I mean,
right,
they aren't all
no
great
doubt.
either. We have to deal with
Most
the positives and negatives that come from those. Yeah.
Right.
So, I think it's interesting because next time we're going to talk, I think, about the global efforts, like in Ecuador, and where they did put rights of nature into the national constitution. And so that's even more than just New York State, right? A state legislature. But we now have examples of how it's been used by the people there. And so this, to me, would be an amazing step forward for the movement. And as to my response to your question about how it affect Canada, other states and all that. Well, I was asked that same question when the Lake Erie Bill of Rights passed. How's this going to impact Canada? And well, if the lakes and waterways and air in New York are less polluted and cleaner, then I guess that helps your state and country too, right? There's not as much pollution coming down the pike at you, both through the water and the air. And so I don't know why you would be nervous about that.
Then they can move toward rights of nature legislation for Canada.
Exactly.
That would be wonderful to see the provinces of Canada also join in, and all of the states bordering on the Great Lakes to get involved and pass similar legislation. But, you asked earlier, and it's true, it's controversial because it's revolutionary. We're actually talking about going, in some sense, for instance, the second part of the bill that empowers local governments to make law that would protect their own rights at the local level. That's a desire, that's an aspiration that Americans have had since 1776. It was the very first complaint that was listed by the colonists in the Declaration of Independence, and say, okay, this is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, okay? The very first complaint, the justification for revolt against the largest empire the world had seen since then, the British Empire. Their first complaint and justification for revolting was, they said that the king disallowed their local governments to pass laws they needed to protect their communities. It wasn't about state laws or federal laws. There weren't any states. There was no federal government. It was about local laws. The very first reason that they mentioned to have a revolution was they were being denied the right to protect their own communities. That's a problem that was not solved by the establishment of the United States of America under the U.S. Constitution. It was not solved. As a matter of fact, local governments aren't mentioned in the federal Constitution. And as a matter of fact, state governments don't recognize them as self-governing entities. They are simply subdivisions, property of each of the states. And that's something that we might want to revisit and say, maybe when they had that revolution thing, they really meant to do what we're trying to do now in the 21st century in New York. Maybe we should just go ahead and do it. Maybe it's time, 250 years later. Just a
Yeah,
thought.
because there's the saying that everyone says politics starts local, right? And so if it's not recognized locally, that I agree 100%. We need to address it. Something that does need to be changed.
To get your vote, they say it.
Right, right. We need to make it a
They
fact.
can't do it, right?
So if
We
you don't
absolutely-
have democracy in the community where you live, where you can actually have some effect on the prospects for your quality of life in the future, if you don't have democracy where you live, show me on the map in the United States where you do have democracy. And the answer is you don't. Now, okay, I know people are going to say, no, we never had a democracy, wasn't intended. We have a republic. Well, darn it, if we have a republic, show me where in the federal system that communities are allowed to actually argue for, lobby for their own interests. And frankly, districts that are, carved out in gerrymandering on the federal level and at the state level, the state level sections of each of the state that find representation in the state legislatures, none of them correspond to communities. They're all just random based on numerical equivalency of the population that they draw the lines around. And they
That's
do
so
it
true.
to benefit whichever of the two private corporations called political parties, whichever one's in power at the time of, the redistricting. And so we don't have representation of communities, let alone direct democracy of them in our federal system. And that can be corrected. But of course, there's resistance to it since the people would then govern the corporations in their communities rather than the corporations governing the people in their communities.
And that's the way it should be. Damn it. It absolutely should be that way. That's such an important point. I think that's a huge conversation that's happening right now on a national level as well, outside of rights of nature, with a lot of people is that it's revolutionary. So this framework being replicated elsewhere. So Patrick Burke took LIBOR and replicated it for New York, and then you modified it for the state of New York. I would like to have a little conversation. A part of this series, starting this series, is because I want to bring rights of nature legislation throughout the Great Lakes Basin region, right? And so replicating, so say, for example, in simple terms, explain this, obviously, because we haven't started this yet, but how could we replicate what's happening in New York at the state level for the Great Lake Basin states? Because there's 8 of them, right? So, and not the full 8 states. It's important to note that the Great Lakes Basin, the watershed, it's not as deep as people think it might be, because we have these 5 massive lakes. But the watershed, when it goes into the states, obviously Michigan is special in that respect because we're literally surrounded on 3 sides by the lakes. But the other 7 states, there's a portion of the state that has the watershed from the Great Lakes coming into it, and then it stops at some point. So it isn't the full states of those other states. But how could we bring and replicate New York Bill of Rights to the rest of the Great Lakes Basin region? And I know we haven't done it, but I'd like to get it in people's minds of what that might look like.
Right. I think, and again, New York I don't think that's the norm, how it should work, because I think it should come again from the people, because we're all about people having the power, right? It's their state. And so I don't even think just coming up with like one, right, and saying they all have to use it, right? Because that's kind of counter to.
It would have to be 7. Yeah.
Yeah.
It would have to be special too.
And they're not all the same. That's the whole point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not every community, ecosystem, watershed, whatever bioregion is the same. They're all unique. They want to make us think that we're all generic, right? And the same, and we're not.
Yeah.
And so I think it would start with groups of people from that state educating themselves about, rights of nature and what this looks like, asking questions themselves. What do they need and want in their states? And we have worked with some since New York on this, certain people in Michigan, some in New Jersey, other places, I think out west now, I think it's Washington that's looking at it. And these are people. And then they need to find a legislator like a Patrick Burke, right? I mean, if a Patrick Burke, there is someone like him in the other states, it could work that way too. But I would hope that they'd get input from their constituents and people who live in the state, right? And that's how it should work. It's a two-way street back and forth. Yeah, but that's how, and then it could be introduced. Just the fact of introducing it is valuable, I think, that which we've talked about today. I mean, and we've seen from the local community ones from Tamaqua Borough that Ben was involved in over 25 years ago to, Libor and Toledo to now New York. I mean, it's a movement. That's all shows growth. Like if you draw it on a map, which we have done in our democracy school, the arrow keeps going up, right? The trajectory of rights of nature. That's what we want to keep moving forward. So even if we have these little setbacks like the federal court overturning Libor, New York still went ahead. Cincinnati.
It's not the end. It's not the end. It's not defeat.
No.
In many ways, it's a civil rights fight that we're having here. The civil right.
I think it is. Yeah.
To protect ourselves. And if we think about the civil rights movement for the rights of African Americans, who descendants of enslaved people, that the 13th Amendment abolished the, institution of human ownership of humans. Abolishing the human ownership of nature is what is on the plate. And that's a huge thing, but so was emancipation of enslaved people in this country. And there were many pushbacks. And we know that even when the 13th Amendment was enacted, that the Supreme Court stepped in full of racist justices, and that's a hell of a thing to call them, who then within just a few years of passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, watered them down and made them less effective and allowed for the Jim Crow laws and the end of Reconstruction and the betrayal of that second American Revolution that we call the Civil War. We know that the pushback can be awfully powerful, and that is something that we have to expect. But if we don't begin, then we'll stay where we are. Well, we won't. We'll kill the planet.
We'll kill it. Yeah, we'll keep going the other direction. So I think that's the first step. The first most important step with this is to start having conversations where you are. Start having them with people. Start gathering and coming together, and what rights of nature legislation would look like in your state, and then moving forward from there.
And I think. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tish.
No, I was just going to say, and I think young people are really the key, because I think that's their futures, right? Like they know something's terribly wrong. They're the one. I mean, when you see, it breaks my heart to see the statistics on like young people now, and the rates of colon cancer and autoimmune diseases. I mean, they're the ones feeling the impact. I mean, Ben got to, we got to be old, right? So it's like, it may still get us, but we got to be old. I mean, they may not get to be old because of and it's because of the toxins and the poisons that, that comes back to that, what we do to nature, we do to ourselves. I'm like, so I think they really need to understand, they don't know what to do, right? And so this gives them something, we could change the system, we could do it differently. And so I think this is something that they really need to be educated about. I don't know how to get to them necessarily, but we need young people on board and to educate them, and hopefully they'll see why this is so important and take it up.
Absolutely. Well, I think, I'm just going to interject with something you just said there. You don't know how to reach them. And that's something that we're going to come into. That's what the Pulse of the Great Lakes is going to become a part of that, because we will start having local conversations. That is to come. So, and then anybody who's interested in that can reach out to us. So at its core, is it about environmental protection, or is it about reclaiming democracy, or is it both? Or is it something else?
I think it's both, but it's more. It's both about protecting. When we say nature, it may have said this before on a previous conversation, but we other nature. We say it's not us, but it is us. We are nature. We kind of had this schizophrenic relationship to the rest of creation. Western philosophy, the Enlightenment and all, says human beings are separate and superior to the natural world, but it's not true. We're part of it. Without it, we die. Without the atmosphere, we die. Without the plants and the animals, we die. They create. We co-create the world for each other. That's what this complex biological just matrix of life that covers this planet does. It really does. And so this law is about protecting. When I say nature, if I use that word, I mean us and everything else. But it's also about allowing the human beings in the communities that they live in to protect the natural communities where they live, because they're part of it. They speak for it when they do so. So it's about democracy as well, but it's also about changing the mindset, the paradigm, the worldview that in our culture makes it justifiable to take whatever you want from nature and use it in any way you want, and then dump the waste material wherever you want and think that, don't worry about it. Nature is really smart and really good at cleaning itself up. That used to be true when we had campfires. That used to be true when we had little villages. It's not so true when we have bulldozers that are these earth moving machines that you look at them and the people that are in them operating them look like little ants inside them. They're so big. When we look at the holes in the ground that are being cut open to get lithium so that we can have batteries for electric vehicles that are supposedly going to protect the environment while we destroy the environment to make those machines, there's something wrong with the way we think. It's not just about what we do. It's how we think that lets us do those things to destroy the earth. And so we need that paradigm shift. The bill it's a teaching machine, if you will. It's there to help point people in a different direction on how to look at their place in the world. And to me, that's a huge component of what this bill and other bills like it are all about.
Thank you both so much again for another great conversation. We are going to continue moving forward. And next time we're going to talk about rights of nature on a global level with Ecuador. And as Tish mentioned, how they have incorporated into their national constitution, right? So thank you again. And we'll see you both next time.
Thanks, Tamara.
Thank you, Tamara.